Your husband's gone. Pack your things and never return. Those were the first words my daughter-in-law said to me after Richard's funeral flowers had barely started to wilt. She said it calmly, almost politely, while setting down a bowl of mashed potatoes at the center of the dining table, as if she were discussing the weather instead of throwing a 71-year-old widow out of her own home. My son Daniel sat beside her, staring at his plate with the same blank expression he'd worn through the entire funeral service. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look surprised. The dining room suddenly felt colder than the February rain tapping softly against the windows. The chandelier above us cast pale yellow light across the mahogany table Richard had spent 6 months restoring with his own hands after he retired. I remember running my fingers along the edge of the tablecloth just to keep my hands from trembling. 1 week earlier, Richard had been sitting at the head of that same table asking me if we still had enough cinnamon for my Sunday apple pie. Now his chair sat empty, pushed slightly back exactly where he'd left it before the ambulance took him away forever. Vanessa folded her napkin carefully and looked at me with a smile so thin it barely reached her eyes. "This house is too much for you now," she continued softly. "Daniel and I have been talking, and honestly, it's probably best if you move somewhere smaller. Somewhere easier. Easier." Funny how cruel people always wrap their cruelty in words that sound helpful. I glanced toward my son again, waiting for him to say something. Anything. I wanted to hear the voice of the little boy who used to crawl into bed beside me during thunderstorms because he was scared of lightning. But that little boy was gone. In his place sat a tired-looking 42-year-old man who suddenly found the mashed potatoes more interesting than his own mother. "Mom," Daniel finally muttered, still not meeting my eyes. "Vanessa's right. The house is just too big now. Too big." I looked around slowly. The framed wedding photos. The grandfather clock Richard inherited from his father. The cream-colored curtains I had sewn myself 30 years ago while 8 months pregnant with Daniel. Every corner of that house held pieces of my life stitched into it. But suddenly, sitting there across from my son and his wife, I realized something painful. They weren't looking at memories. They were looking at square footage, property taxes, market value. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "We'll give you 2 weeks," she said. "That should be enough time." 2 weeks. After 43 years of marriage. After nursing Richard through chemo appointments and sleepless nights and hospital bills. 2 weeks to erase an entire life. I expected myself to cry. I expected anger or panic or humiliation. But instead, something inside me became strangely calm. Maybe grief changes people in ways they don't expect. Maybe losing the love of your life leaves no room to fear anything else. I simply nodded once and took a sip of my cold coffee. Vanessa looked almost disappointed by my silence. Cruel people enjoy reactions. They feed on tears. Daniel finally looked up at me then, just for a second, and I saw guilt flicker across his face before disappearing again beneath exhaustion and cowardice. "I think this is best for everyone," he whispered. I smiled softly, not because I was happy, because suddenly I understood something very clearly. Richard had spent 43 years teaching me never to panic before understanding the whole picture. "Of course," I said quietly, "if that's what you both want." Vanessa's shoulders relaxed instantly. She thought she'd won. That was her first mistake. Dinner ended in silence after that. I cleared my own plate and washed my coffee cup, while Vanessa scrolled through real estate listings on her phone at the kitchen counter. Daniel disappeared upstairs without a word. I could hear the floorboards creaking above me while the rain outside grew heavier. For a moment, I stood alone at the sink staring out the dark kitchen window at the backyard Richard loved so much. The bird feeder still hung near the oak tree, half full. He always remembered to refill it every Thursday morning. My chest tightened so sharply I had to grip the edge of the counter. Grief is strange. It sneaks up inside ordinary moments. Not during funerals or sympathy cards. During things like seeing your husband's gardening gloves still hanging beside the back door. I dried my hands carefully and walked upstairs to our bedroom. Richard's side of the bed remained untouched exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside the mystery novel he never got to finish. I sat down slowly on the edge of the mattress and let the silence settle around me. Then I opened the bottom drawer of Richard's old dresser. Beneath a stack of folded sweaters sat a small blue music box with faded gold trim around the edges. My fingers froze instantly when I saw it. 2 months before his death, Richard had handed me that same box while we sat on the porch swing watching snow fall across the backyard. "If anything ever happens to me," he'd said quietly, "trust the blue box." At the time, I laughed and told him he sounded dramatic. He only smiled sadly and squeezed my hand. I hadn't thought about those words again until now. My heartbeat quickened as I lifted the lid. The tiny ballerina inside no longer spun properly, but hidden beneath the velvet lining was a small silver key taped carefully underneath. I stared at it for a long moment while thunder rolled faintly outside the bedroom window. Downstairs, I heard Vanessa laughing softly on the phone. "She didn't even argue," she whispered. Honestly, it was easier than I expected. Something cold settled deep in my stomach then. Not fear. Clarity. I closed the music box gently and slipped the key into my coat pocket. The next morning, before sunrise, I packed one suitcase, made the bed one final time, and walked downstairs carrying my purse and Richard's old leather overnight bag. Daniel stood near the coffee maker looking exhausted. For a second, he looked almost relieved to see me leaving quietly. Vanessa appeared moments later wearing silk pajamas and holding her coffee mug with both hands. "You're leaving already?" she asked, trying and failing to sound surprised. "I thought I'd make things easier for everyone," I replied calmly. Her lips twitched upward just slightly. Daniel opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Cowardice has a way of silencing people at the exact moment truth matters most. I picked up my coat from the hook beside the door and paused one final time in the hallway. Family photos lined the walls beside me. Christmas mornings, beach vacations, birthday dinners, decades of smiles frozen behind glass. I suddenly realized how many of those moments had probably already been forgotten by everyone except me. Vanessa stepped closer and folded her arms. "Where will you go?" she asked. I looked at her for a long moment before smiling gently. "Somewhere safe," I said. Then I walked out into the cold February morning, carrying the only thing Richard truly wanted me to protect. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled into the parking lot of the Pinewood Inn just outside Hartford. The motel sign flickered weakly in the gray morning light, and the air smelled like wet asphalt and pine trees. It was the kind of roadside place people passed without noticing. Cheap curtains, faded carpets, coffee that tasted burned no matter how much cream you added. But at that moment, it felt safer than the house I had lived in for more than 4 decades. I carried my suitcase inside slowly, my shoulder aching from the weight of it, and from the stiffness grief seemed to leave in my bones these days. The young woman behind the front desk looked up from her computer and gave me a tired smile. "One night or longer stay?" she asked politely. I hesitated for just a second. Longer stay? The words felt strange in my mouth, like admitting something permanent had broken. "A few nights," I answered quietly. She handed me a room key attached to a plastic tag with faded numbers scratched into the surface. Room 214. Upstairs. No elevator. I thanked her anyway. People learn to carry heavy things when life gives them no choice. The room smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and old air conditioning. A small lamp glowed beside the bed, casting warm yellow light across floral wallpaper that had probably not changed since the 1990s. I set Richard's leather bag carefully beside the dresser and sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment without moving. Silence filled the room immediately. Not peaceful silence. Hollow silence. The kind that reminds you nobody knows where you are. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small silver key from the blue music box. It rested cold against my palm while rainwater from my sleeve slowly dried against the fabric of my coat. Richard had hidden it for a reason. I knew that much now. My husband was not dramatic by nature. He believed in preparation. Quiet preparation. During our marriage, he kept emergency cash hidden in old soup cans in the pantry during recession years because he worried about layoffs. He changed smoke detector batteries every October like clockwork. He read legal documents twice before signing anything. If Richard hid that key, it meant he had seen something coming before I did. That thought sat heavily in my chest. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes for a moment. Memories arrived whether I wanted them or not. Richard standing at the kitchen counter every Sunday morning making pancakes slightly too dark because he always forgot to lower the heat. Richard humming old Frank Sinatra songs while watering tomatoes in the backyard. Richard squeezing my hand during doctor appointments even when he was the one receiving bad news. We had built an ordinary life together. and suddenly ordinary felt like the most precious thing in the world. A sharp knock startled me from my thoughts. I opened my eyes quickly, heart pounding harder than it should have. But it was only Martha Green standing outside the motel room, holding 2 paper coffee cups in her gloved hands. Martha had been my neighbor for nearly 20 years. She was 68, sharp-tongued, fiercely loyal, and somehow always knew when something was wrong before anyone else did. "You were not answering your phone," she said the moment I opened the door. "So I figured either you were sleeping or hiding from the world." She stepped inside without waiting for permission and handed me one of the coffees. "Probably both," I admitted softly. Martha glanced around the small motel room, and something sad flickered across her face before she covered it quickly with annoyance. "I swear, Eleanor, if Richard could see this nonsense, he would climb straight out of heaven just to yell at your son." I gave a weak laugh despite myself. Martha sat down near the window and removed her gloves slowly. "Vanessa changed the locks this morning," she said carefully. My stomach tightened instantly. "How do you know?" "Because she hired my nephew's locksmith company." Martha shook her head in disgust. "And before you ask, yes, she already started cleaning out the basement too." Basement? The word landed strangely. Richard spent more time in the basement workshop during his final year than ever before. At the time, I assumed it helped distract him from the treatments and doctor visits. But now another memory surfaced suddenly. About 6 months earlier, I had walked downstairs looking for old Christmas decorations and found Richard quickly closing a file cabinet drawer the moment he saw me. He smiled afterward, but it had looked forced. "Just organizing paperwork," he had said. I remembered thinking nothing of it then. Now every small moment from the past year felt different somehow, like puzzle pieces turning over one by one. Martha studied my face carefully. "You know something, don't you?" she asked quietly. I looked down at the silver key still resting in my hand. "I think Richard did," I answered. Martha's expression shifted immediately. She lowered her voice even though we were alone. "Eleanor, 2 weeks before Richard passed, I saw Vanessa outside your mailbox." I frowned slightly. Outside the mailbox. She was opening letters before bringing them inside. My chest tightened. "Are you sure?" "I am old, not blind," Martha replied sharply. "And there is more." She hesitated for the first time since entering the room. That alone frightened me. "About a month ago, Richard asked me if I still had the number for Harold Bennett." Harold Bennett, Richard's attorney. We had not spoken to Harold in years except for Christmas cards. Why would Richard contact Harold? I whispered. Martha shook her head slowly. "I do not know, but he seemed worried, really worried." I stared at the motel carpet while my thoughts raced faster than I could organize them. Richard had hidden a key, contacted our attorney in secret, kept documents downstairs. And now Vanessa was suddenly desperate to search the basement the moment I left the house. No, not desperate. Hunting. A cold wave of realization rolled through me so sharply it almost made me dizzy. The house was never the real target. Martha stood and walked toward the small table near the television where I had placed Richard's leather bag. "You should open it," she said softly. "Open what?" She pointed toward the bag. "Whatever Richard left you." For a moment, I simply stared at the worn brown leather. Richard carried that overnight bag during every business trip for almost 30 years. I suddenly remembered how strangely protective he had become of it during the final months before his death. He never let Daniel move it, never let Vanessa touch it. My fingers trembled slightly as I unzipped the bag and looked inside. At first, it appeared ordinary enough. Folded sweaters, a shaving kit, prescription, bottles. But beneath the clothes sat a sealed manila envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's careful handwriting. Eleanor. Only that. Nothing else. My throat tightened instantly. Martha moved beside me silently while I lifted the envelope into my lap. The paper felt heavier than it should have. For several seconds, I could not bring myself to open it. Because deep down, I already knew something inside that envelope was about to change everything I thought I understood about my family. My hands trembled slightly as I slid my finger beneath the seal of the envelope. Richard had always opened letters carefully, never tearing paper if he could help it. "You can tell a lot about people by how they handle fragile things," he used to say whenever Daniel ripped through birthday cards as a child. That memory hit me, so suddenly I had to pause for a moment before unfolding the first sheet inside. Martha sat quietly beside the window while rainwater slid slowly down the motel glass behind her. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy with something larger than grief now, larger than betrayal. The letter inside was handwritten in Richard's neat blue ink. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then it means I ran out of time. I stared at those words until they blurred slightly. Richard's voice filled my head instantly. Calm, warm, steady. I swallowed hard and continued reading. There are things I should have told you sooner, but I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept hoping our son would wake up before it was too late. My chest tightened painfully. Martha leaned forward slightly, but said nothing. Richard continued. Vanessa is not after the house. The house is simply the easiest way for her to control Daniel. What she truly wants is access to the Whitmore Trust and the business accounts tied to it. I lowered the paper slowly. Whitmore Trust, I whispered aloud. Martha frowned. I thought Richard sold his company years ago. He did, I replied quietly. At least, I thought he did. Another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 years earlier, Richard had spent several weeks meeting privately with financial advisors after selling his construction firm. He told me not to worry about the details because everything was taken care of. At the time, I trusted him completely. I never asked questions. Richard had always handled the complicated things so I could focus on simpler parts of life. Family dinners, holidays, grandchildren someday, though those never came. I looked back down at the letter. 6 months ago, I discovered irregular withdrawals from one of the reserve accounts connected to the trust. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Enough to concern me. Enough to investigate quietly. My pulse quickened. Richard had known. Somehow, during treatments and doctor visits and all those nights I thought he was simply tired, my husband had been uncovering something terrible beneath our own roof. I kept reading. I did not tell Daniel because I no longer knew how much influence Vanessa had over him. And I did not tell you because I needed proof first. If I failed to stop this before my death, Harold Bennett has everything you need. Inside the envelope sat another folded document. I opened it carefully and found printed bank statements covered with Richard's handwritten notes in the margins. Red circles, dates, transfer amounts. Some withdrawals totaled $5,000. Others nearly $20,000. Over 2 years, the missing money added up to almost $400,000. My stomach dropped. Martha inhaled sharply beside me. Dear God, she whispered. My eyes moved slowly across the pages until one detail froze me completely. The authorization signatures. Vanessa Whitmore. My hands suddenly felt ice cold. How could she access those accounts? Martha asked softly. I shook my head slowly. She should not have been able to. But even as I said it, another memory returned. About a year earlier, Richard underwent a difficult round of treatments that left him exhausted and disoriented for weeks. Vanessa started helping with paperwork around that time. Insurance forms, banking mail, online passwords. I remembered feeling grateful then. Grateful that my daughter-in-law seemed so attentive during Richard's illness. I almost laughed at my own foolishness now. Predators often arrive disguised as caretakers. The motel room suddenly felt too small, too warm. I stood and walked toward the air conditioner just to steady myself. Outside, cars passed slowly through the wet parking lot while gray clouds hung low across the Connecticut sky. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice before falling silent again. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while mine cracked apart piece by piece. There is more, Martha said quietly behind me. I turned back toward the bed. She pointed toward another folded sheet. Near the bottom of the envelope. I picked it up carefully. This one was not handwritten. It was a photocopy of an email chain between Vanessa and someone named Gregory Mills. The first message made my breath catch instantly. Once Richard signs the final revisions, Daniel becomes primary beneficiary. After that, Eleanor will not matter. My knees weakened so sharply I sat back down immediately. Vanessa had planned this. Not emotionally. Financially. Carefully. Methodically. The next message chilled me even more. Gregory replied, Are you certain the old man is still mentally sharp enough to notice the account transfers? Vanessa's response came 2 hours later. He notices less these days, especially when Eleanor keeps distracting him with doctor appointments. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. Not because of tears, because of disbelief. Richard had trusted her enough to sit at our dinner table every Sunday. Trusted her enough to hand her family recipes after she married Daniel. Trusted her enough to let her manage medical paperwork during his treatments. And all that time, she had been calculating his decline like numbers on a spreadsheet. Martha covered her mouth with one hand. That woman is evil, she whispered. But strangely, I no longer felt shocked. Sad, yes. Deeply sad. But not shocked. Looking back now, the signs had been there for years. Vanessa discouraging Daniel from visiting too often because we all need boundaries. Vanessa asking detailed questions about property taxes and investment accounts during Thanksgiving dinners while pretending casual curiosity. Vanessa slowly convincing Daniel that family traditions were outdated obligations instead of meaningful memories. Manipulation rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one small permission at a time. I continued sorting through the documents until something small slipped from the envelope onto the bedspread. A photograph. I picked it up carefully. It showed Richard standing beside Harold Bennett outside Harold's office downtown. The date printed in the corner showed it was taken just 11 days before Richard died. On the back, Richard had written only one sentence. Trust nobody except Harold and Martha. My throat tightened painfully again. Even at the end, Richard had been trying to protect me. I closed my eyes briefly and pictured him sitting alone somewhere inside that big, quiet house, while Vanessa searched for signatures and Daniel drifted farther away under her influence. How frightened he must have felt carrying all this. Alone during his final months. How exhausted. A sudden knock at the motel room door startled both Martha and me. We froze instantly. Another knock followed, firmer this time. My heartbeat pounded hard against my ribs. Martha stood slowly and moved toward the door while I quickly gathered the papers back into the envelope. Who is it? Martha called sharply. Silence answered first. Then a man's voice. Mrs. Whitmore? My blood turned cold instantly. My name is Harold Bennett. Richard asked me to find you if anything ever happened. Martha looked back at me carefully. Fear flickered briefly across her face before hardening into caution. I stood slowly, clutching Richard's envelope tightly against my chest. Because suddenly I understood something terrifying. Richard had not left me clues for comfort. He had left them because he knew the danger had already started before he died. Harold Bennett looked older than I remembered. His silver hair was thinner now, and deep lines framed his mouth, but his posture remained straight and careful in the way only lifelong attorneys seem capable of maintaining. Rain dotted the shoulders of his dark wool coat as he stood outside the motel room, holding a leather folder tightly beneath one arm. Martha opened the door only halfway at first. How did you find her? She asked sharply. Harold removed his glasses slowly and looked past her toward me. Because Richard made me promise I would, he answered quietly. Something in his voice made the room feel suddenly colder. Martha stepped aside reluctantly, though she kept her eyes fixed on him the entire time he entered. Harold nodded politely toward her before turning back to me. Eleanor, he said softly, I am very sorry. Hearing someone say my husband's name with genuine sadness nearly broke something inside me all over again. But grief no longer arrived like a storm. It came now like waves. Quiet. Heavy. Constant. Harold sat carefully in the chair beside the small motel table and placed the leather folder in front of him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The hum of the motel air conditioner filled the silence while headlights from passing cars slid briefly across the curtains. Finally, Harold folded his hands together and looked directly at me. Richard became concerned about Vanessa nearly a year ago, he said. My chest tightened instantly. Why did he not tell me? Harold's expression darkened with regret. Because he believed Daniel would eventually realize what was happening on his own. And because he did not want to burden you while he was sick. That sounded exactly like Richard. Even dying, he worried more about protecting other people's peace than his own. Harold opened the folder slowly and removed several documents bound neatly with clips and colored tabs. Legal papers, financial statements, property records. The kind of paperwork Richard always handled quietly behind the scenes while I worried about grocery lists and family birthdays. Your husband came to my office 11 days before his death, Harold continued. He was weaker than I had ever seen him. But mentally, Harold paused slightly. Mentally, he was sharper than ever. I lowered my eyes toward the motel carpet while my fingers tightened around the coffee cup in my lap. I could picture Richard perfectly now, pale from treatments, thin hands resting on his cane, but still observant, still calculating, still trying to hold everything together even while his own body failed him. Harold slid one document carefully across the table toward me. This is the original structure of the Whitmore family trust. I frowned slightly. I thought the trust only covered the house. That is what Daniel believes, Harold replied quietly. And that is what Vanessa believes as well. Martha leaned forward instantly. Meaning? Harold adjusted his glasses before answering. Meaning the house was never the primary asset. The room fell silent again. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows once more. Harold opened another file and continued speaking in the calm, measured voice attorneys use when delivering difficult truths. When Richard sold Whitmore Construction 3 years ago, he retained partial ownership rights to several commercial properties and investment accounts connected to the company's pension reserves. I blinked slowly, trying to process his words. How much are we talking about? Harold hesitated briefly. Including current valuations? Approximately $12 million. Martha actually gasped aloud. But strangely, the number itself did not shock me as much as what came after it. Because suddenly everything made sense. Vanessa's obsession with paperwork. Her constant questions about investments. The strange urgency after Richard's funeral. They were never trying to remove me emotionally. They were trying to remove me legally. Daniel does not know about the money, Harold added carefully. Richard intentionally kept him uninvolved after Vanessa gained access to certain accounts. I looked up sharply. You mean Richard stopped trusting his own son? Harold's silence answered before his words did. My throat tightened painfully again. Daniel had once cried for 3 straight days when our family dog died, because he could not bear losing something he loved. I used to think kindness like that could never disappear from a person completely. But kindness unattended can be slowly replaced by weakness. And weakness in the hands of manipulative people becomes dangerous. Harold slid another document toward me. 3 months ago, Richard discovered unauthorized account transfers connected to Vanessa's login credentials. He confronted her privately. My heartbeat quickened instantly. What happened? Harold removed his glasses again and rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. According to Richard, Vanessa denied everything. She claimed she was simply reorganizing account access to help Daniel manage future responsibilities. I almost laughed bitterly at that. Vanessa always sounded reasonable when outsiders listened. Calm, polished, helpful. That was what made her dangerous. She weaponized politeness. Harold continued quietly. Richard pretended to believe her. I stared at him. Pretended. Harold nodded once. He told me afterward that he wanted to see how far she would go if she believed she had already succeeded. A chill moved slowly down my spine then, because suddenly I understood the final months of my husband's life differently. Richard had not simply been ill. He had been watching, gathering proof, preparing. There is something else, Harold said softly. He opened the final section of the folder and removed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting again. Your husband instructed me to give you this only after you left the house willingly. I frowned slightly. Willingly. His exact words were, if Vanessa forces Eleanor out, then I will know everything I suspected was true. Tears finally burned behind my eyes then. Not because of the betrayal. Because Richard knew me well enough to understand I would leave quietly rather than fight inside the home we built together. Even now, after death, he was still one step ahead of everyone. My fingers shook as I opened the second envelope. Inside was a single key card and a short handwritten note. Safe deposit box. Hartford Federal Bank. Account under your name only. Everything you need is there. Do not trust Daniel until you know the full truth. I read the final sentence 3 times before, lowering the note slowly into my lap. Martha looked horrified beside me. Richard thought Daniel was involved. Harold answered carefully. Richard believed Daniel was being manipulated. But he was no longer certain where manipulation ended and complicity began. The distinction landed heavily inside me. Because deep down, I had been asking myself the same question ever since Daniel sat silently beside Vanessa at that dinner table. Had my son simply become weak? Or had he willingly chosen greed over loyalty long ago? Harold checked his watch briefly before standing. We should go to the bank tomorrow morning before Vanessa realizes you have contacted me. My stomach tightened instantly. You think she is watching? Harold gave me a long look. Eleanor. Richard hired a private investigator 6 weeks before he died. My breath caught. What? Harold nodded grimly. And according to the investigator's report, Vanessa began monitoring Richard's communications shortly after his final hospitalization. The motel room suddenly felt too exposed, too visible. Martha crossed her arms tightly beside the window. That woman really believed Richard would just hand her everything. Harold's expression hardened for the first time since arriving. No, he said quietly. She believed she had already taken it. Thunder rumbled faintly outside while I stared down at the keycard resting in my palm. Richard had hidden pieces of the truth everywhere like breadcrumbs leading towards something much larger than stolen money. And for the first time since his funeral, fear began settling slowly beneath my grief. Because if Vanessa believed millions of dollars were still hidden somewhere inside that house, then she was not going to stop searching anytime soon. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard sitting alone in his basement workshop sorting through papers while Vanessa smiled upstairs pretending to be part of the family. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to rest and sat beside the motel window wrapped in one of Richard's old flannel shirts. Outside, the parking lot glistened beneath pale security lights while trucks rolled slowly along the highway beyond the pine trees. The world looked quiet, ordinary, but inside me, something had changed permanently. Grief was no longer the only thing sitting in my chest. Now there was anger too. Not loud anger, not reckless anger, the cold kind. The kind that arrives when trust finally breaks beyond repair. By 7:30. The next morning, Harold arrived outside the motel carrying 2 coffees and a stack of folders tucked beneath his arm again. Martha insisted on coming with us despite Harold warning her the situation might become complicated. I have been waiting 20 years to legally annoy rich people, she replied dryly while buttoning her coat. Do not rob me of this opportunity. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. The drive into downtown Hartford passed mostly in silence. Rain clouds still hung low across the city skyline, and dirty snow lined the curbs beside office buildings and old brick storefronts. Harold drove carefully, one hand resting on the steering wheel while the other occasionally adjusted papers beside him at stoplights. Finally, he spoke quietly without taking his eyes off the road. There is something important you need to understand before we enter that bank. I looked over at him. What? Harold exhaled slowly. Richard changed the structure of the trust 3 weeks before he died. My stomach tightened instantly. Changed it how? Harold glanced toward me briefly. Originally, Daniel inherited operational control after Richard's death, while you retained lifetime residential rights to the property. Martha frowned from the back seat. Meaning Vanessa expected Daniel to control everything once Eleanor passed away. Exactly, Harold replied. But after Richard uncovered the unauthorized transfers, he amended the entire structure. My pulse quickened. What does that mean for Daniel? Harold's expression remained unreadable. That depends entirely on what happens next. We pulled into the underground parking garage beneath Hartford Federal Bank shortly afterward. The building itself looked old and imposing, with polished granite floors and brass railings that reflected soft yellow light across the lobby. Everything smelled faintly like leather, coffee, and expensive cleaning products. Harold led us toward a private office near the back, while bank employees nodded politely at him as though he visited often. A middle-aged woman named Cynthia greeted us with practiced professionalism before leading us through another secured door into the vault area downstairs. The air felt cooler there. Still, quiet enough to hear the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Cynthia stopped beside a row of steel safe deposit boxes and glanced toward me kindly. Mrs. Whitmore, your husband updated access authorization personally last month, she explained softly. Only you are listed now. Only you. The words settled strangely inside me. For 43 years, Richard and I handled everything together. Bills, vacations, illness, repairs, decisions. Now suddenly I was standing alone in a cold bank vault holding keys to secrets he never lived long enough to explain himself. Cynthia unlocked the box first, then stepped away to give us privacy. My hands shook slightly as I slid the long metal drawer outward. Inside sat several thick folders, 2 flash drives, and a sealed envelope marked final instructions. Harold went still beside me the moment he saw it. Richard told me about the files, he said quietly, but not the envelope. I picked it up slowly. Richard's handwriting covered the front again. Eleanor, if you are opening this, then Vanessa pushed harder and faster than I hoped she would. My throat tightened instantly. I carefully unfolded the papers inside, while Martha moved closer beside me. The first page contained detailed account records. Not only the missing transfers we already knew about, but dozens more. Hidden purchases, offshore accounts, credit lines connected to shell companies. The deeper I read, the more horrifying the pattern became. Vanessa had not simply stolen money. She had been building an escape plan. Quietly, patiently, one transaction at a time. My God, Martha whispered. Harold's face darkened as he reviewed the records beside me. This is organized fraud, he muttered under his breath. Then I reached the final pages. And suddenly my blood turned cold. Because several transfers carried Daniel's authorization code beside them. I stared at the numbers, unable to breathe for a moment. No, I whispered automatically. There has to be some mistake. Harold looked carefully at the pages before speaking. These codes required direct approval from the secondary trustee. Daniel would never. My voice broke before finishing the sentence. But even as denial rose inside me, memories returned one after another with painful clarity. Daniel dismissing financial questions whenever I brought them up. Daniel insisting Richard should simplify things during treatments. Daniel quietly avoiding eye contact during the funeral dinner. Weakness, cowardice, silence. How long had I mistaken those things for confusion when they were really guilt? Harold placed another document carefully in front of me. Richard left recorded evidence as well. My heartbeat pounded harder. Harold inserted one of the flash drives into his laptop, while Martha moved beside me quietly. After a few clicks, Richard's face appeared on the screen. The video quality looked grainy, probably filmed late at night inside his basement workshop. My husband looked exhausted, pale, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp, focused. Eleanor, he began softly, if you are seeing this, then I am gone. And if Harold is with you, then things unfolded exactly the way I feared they would. Tears blurred my vision instantly. Hearing Richard's voice again after the funeral nearly shattered me. He paused briefly on screen, rubbing one hand against his chest before continuing. I need you to listen carefully. Daniel is not innocent. But he is also not the architect. My stomach twisted painfully. Richard sighed heavily before speaking again. Vanessa spent years convincing him that I valued money more than family. She made him believe he deserved control because I was too stubborn to let go. Eventually, he stopped questioning her decisions because questioning them meant admitting how far things had gone. Harold lowered his eyes quietly while the video continued. I tried confronting Daniel privately 3 months ago, Richard said. He promised me he would fix things. But afterward, the transfers continued. My chest hurt so badly I pressed one hand against it instinctively. Richard leaned closer toward the camera then, his expression hardening for the first time. If Vanessa forces you from the house after my death, then you must understand something clearly. She believes there is one final account she has not found yet. Martha frowned slightly beside me. Final account. Richard nodded slowly on screen as though hearing the question himself. The account does exist, but only Eleanor can access it. Harold straightened instantly beside me. Richard never told me this part. Richard continued quietly. The final account contains every controlling asset tied to the trust. Commercial properties, pension reserves, investment authority, everything. My breath caught. And if Daniel stands beside Vanessa after learning the truth, Richard said slowly, then he loses all inheritance permanently. Silence filled the vault room after the video ended. Heavy silence. The kind that changes people. I stared at the dark laptop screen while my thoughts spun violently inside me. My son had betrayed me. Maybe not completely at first. Maybe not intentionally in the beginning. But somewhere along the way, he crossed a line he could no longer pretend not to see. Harold closed the laptop carefully. Eleanor, he said softly, under the amended trust structure, you now control everything. I looked down at Richard's final letter resting in my lap, while tears finally slid quietly down my face. Not because of the money. Because even while dying, my husband spent his last strength trying to save me from the people we trusted most. Then Harold spoke one final sentence that made the air leave my lungs completely. And according to the timestamps on the security logs, he said carefully, someone tried accessing this safe deposit box late last night after the locks were changed at your house. The drive back from the bank felt different somehow. The city outside Harold's windshield looked sharper now, colder and more dangerous than it had only a few days earlier. Every stranger on the sidewalk suddenly seemed capable of hiding secrets. Every passing car made me glance twice in the side mirror without meaning to. Richard had spent months uncovering a betrayal while pretending everything was normal. Now I understood why he looked so exhausted near the end. Carrying the truth alone changes the way people move through the world. Martha remained unusually quiet in the back seat, while Harold focused on traffic. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes of silence, Martha spoke softly. "So what happens now?" Harold tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel before answering. "Now we stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically." I looked over at him. Meaning Vanessa still believes she is in control," Harold replied calmly. "And right now, that is our advantage." Advantage? Strange word. I had spent most of my life avoiding conflict whenever possible, keeping peace during family arguments, softening hard conversations, letting small hurts pass quietly because family mattered more than pride. But sitting there beside Harold, holding Richard's documents against my chest, I realized something painful. Peace only works when everyone values it equally. Vanessa never did. Harold parked outside a small diner several miles from downtown shortly afterward. The sign outside flickered red and blue beneath the cloudy afternoon sky, and the smell of bacon and coffee wrapped around us the moment we stepped inside. The place looked frozen somewhere around 1985. Vinyl booths, a cracked pie display near the register, country music playing softly through old ceiling speakers. Normally Richard would have loved it. He always trusted restaurants where the waitresses called everyone Han. We slid into a booth near the back, while Harold spread several papers carefully across the table between coffee, cups and sugar packets. Richard created multiple fail-safes, he explained quietly. If Vanessa attempted to pressure you out of the house after his death, full asset control transferred immediately to you. Martha shook her head in disbelief. So the moment Eleanor left willingly, Vanessa lost everything she thought she was gaining, Harold finished. I stared down at the papers while my mind replayed that final dinner again. Vanessa calmly serving mashed potatoes. Daniel staring silently at the table. The confidence in her voice when she gave me 2 weeks to leave. She truly believed I was powerless. The realization should have satisfied me somehow. Instead, it only made me sad. Because none of this had to happen. Families do not collapse overnight. They crack slowly. Quietly, one selfish decision at a time. Harold pointed toward one specific file. "This concerns me most." I looked down and saw copies of property access logs from the house security system. Several entries highlighted in yellow showed repeated basement activity during the nights immediately following Richard's funeral. Vanessa entered the basement 9 separate times between midnight and 4 in the morning. My stomach tightened. She was searching for something. Harold nodded once. Most likely the final account records Richard mentioned. Martha folded her arms tightly. "Can she access anything without Eleanor?" "No," Harold replied firmly. "But she does not know that yet." A waitress arrived with coffee refills and slices of apple pie none of us touched. Once she left, Harold lowered his voice even further. "There is another issue." My chest tightened instantly. "What now?" Harold removed a folded paper from his briefcase and slid it toward me carefully. It was a property transfer draft dated 3 days before Richard's funeral. My eyes moved slowly across the page until I saw Daniel's signature near the bottom. "No," I whispered immediately. Harold's expression remained calm but grim. The transfer was incomplete because the trust restructuring overrode it before filing. But Vanessa clearly intended to move the property quickly after Richard's death. I stared at my son's signature while something deep inside me quietly broke again. Not loudly, just enough to understand the truth clearly for the first time. Daniel knew more than I wanted to believe. Maybe not everything, but enough. He signed documents while his father was dying upstairs in hospice care. He sat silently while his wife forced me from my own home. And somewhere along the way, he stopped being the boy who once cried because he accidentally stepped on a butterfly in our backyard garden. I looked out the diner window toward the gray parking lot while memories rose one after another without permission. Daniel at 6 years old proudly bringing me dandelions because he thought they looked like tiny suns. Daniel learning to drive while Richard nervously gripped the dashboard beside him. Daniel crying at our kitchen table after his first heartbreak in college while I made grilled cheese sandwiches because it was the only thing he could stomach. Where does that version of a child go? Or does it simply get buried beneath years of weakness and influence until even they cannot recognize themselves anymore? Harold's voice pulled me gently back to the present. "Eleanor." I looked up slowly. "Richard anticipated that you might hesitate once Daniel became involved. My throat tightened. Because he knew me. Harold nodded quietly. Yes. He opened another folder and handed me a final handwritten note from Richard. The paper looked worn from being folded and unfolded many times. I recognized my husband's handwriting instantly. Eleanor, if you are struggling to see Daniel clearly, remember this. Good people can make terrible choices when they spend too long excusing smaller ones first. Do not confuse love with permission. Tears burned behind my eyes immediately. Richard understood me too well. Even now, part of me still wanted to protect Daniel from consequences. Mothers are dangerous that way. We spend decades convincing ourselves our children are better than their worst decisions. Harold leaned forward carefully. Vanessa is going to realize soon that the trust did not activate the way she expected. Once that happens, she will start looking for you directly. Martha snorted softly. Good luck to her. But Harold did not smile. I am serious. The heaviness in his voice made my stomach tighten again. Richard believed Vanessa became increasingly desperate during the last few months, especially after he quietly froze several account pathways. I stared at him. You think she is unstable? Harold considered the question carefully before answering. I think she is someone who spent years building a future she believed was guaranteed. People like that do not respond well when control disappears suddenly. Outside the diner window, snowflakes had started falling lightly again, swirling across the parking lot in slow white circles. Everything looked softer beneath the snow, calmer. But I knew better now than to trust appearances. My phone suddenly vibrated inside my purse. All three of us froze instantly. I slowly pulled it out and stared at the screen. Daniel. My chest tightened painfully at the sight of his name. The same phone number I used to call after every parent-teacher conference, every Christmas shopping trip, every emergency. Now it looked unfamiliar somehow, like a stranger borrowing my son's voice. Harold watched me carefully. You do not have to answer. But after several seconds, I pressed accept anyway. Hello. Silence greeted me first. Then Daniel's voice came softly through the line. Tired. Uneasy. Mom. Hearing him call me, that almost hurt worse than the betrayal itself. Where are you? He asked quietly. I glanced toward Harold before answering. Why? Another pause. Long enough to feel dangerous. Then Daniel spoke again, lower this time. Because Vanessa is tearing apart the house looking for something Dad hid. And I think she is starting to scare me. For several seconds, I could not answer him. The sounds of the diner faded into the background while I held the phone tightly against my ear. Plates clattered somewhere near the kitchen. Coffee machines hissed. A waitress laughed softly near the register. Ordinary sounds. But beneath Daniel's voice, I heard something unfamiliar for the first time in years. Fear. Real fear. Mom, he repeated quietly. I closed my eyes for a moment before speaking. What exactly is Vanessa doing? There was hesitation on the line. The kind that comes when someone realizes they can no longer hide behind partial truths. She has been searching the basement since last night, Daniel admitted finally. Dad's office too. She barely slept. I exchanged a quick glance with Harold across the booth. His expression remained calm, but I noticed the slight tightening around his jaw. He already suspected where this conversation was heading. And you just let her? I asked softly. Silence answered first. Then Daniel sighed heavily into the phone. Mom, I did not think any of this was serious before. Before. Such a dangerous word. Before I watched my mother leave the house in tears. Before my father died suspicious and exhausted. Before I noticed my wife tearing apart rooms like she was hunting for buried gold. People always discover morality too late once consequences begin touching them. Personally, what changed? I asked quietly. Daniel lowered his voice even further. Last night, I found Vanessa going through Dad's workshop with a flashlight. My stomach tightened instantly. Richard's workshop. The one place in the house he guarded carefully during his final months. I could still picture him sitting at that old wooden workbench beneath the yellow hanging lamp while snow fell softly outside the basement windows. He used to disappear downstairs for hours pretending he was organizing tools or fixing old radios. All that time, he was probably protecting evidence. She told me she was looking for insurance documents. Daniel continued nervously. But when I asked why she was prying open floor panels in the storage room, his voice trailed off. Harold slowly set down his coffee cup beside him. Martha folded her arms tightly and stared at the table with visible disgust. Daniel, I said carefully, how much did you know? The silence that followed hurt more than shouting ever could have. long enough for truth to settle heavily between us. Finally, he answered, "Not everything. Not everything." My chest tightened painfully, because that was not denial. That was confession wrapped in cowardice. Dad thought Vanessa was moving money around because she was helping us prepare for the future, Daniel said quickly, almost defensively now. She told me the trust was complicated and that Dad kept refusing to simplify things. I stared out the diner window while snow continued drifting slowly across parked cars outside. "And you believed her?" Daniel exhaled shakily. "At first, yes. At first." Another dangerous phrase. Mom. She always made it sound reasonable. Like Dad was just controlling. Like he never trusted us enough to let go. His words stirred painful memories immediately. Richard refusing to discuss account details during family dinners. Richard quietly changing passwords late at night. Richard insisting on keeping certain files locked away downstairs. Back then, even I sometimes wondered if he was becoming overly cautious after retirement. I hated myself for that now. Because while I questioned him silently, my husband was protecting us from the very people sitting at our table every Sunday. And after that, I asked softly. Daniel's breathing grew uneven through the phone. After that, things kept getting bigger. My eyes closed slowly. There it was. The truth Richard already knew before he died. Small compromises become larger ones when people are too weak to stop themselves early. Vanessa said we deserved more control, Daniel continued. She kept saying Dad treated us like children, that he never respected us enough to trust us. Harold shook his head faintly beside me, almost sadly. Predators always learn which insecurities to feed first. Did you know money was missing? I asked. Another pause. Then quietly, not at first. My fingers tightened harder around the phone. But eventually? Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Mom. By the time I realized how serious it was, Vanessa already had access to everything. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced my voice to remain steady. So instead of stopping her, you stayed silent. His answer came almost immediately this time. I was trying to fix it. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of that sentence. People destroy trust quietly and then call themselves victims when consequences arrive loudly. Dad confronted me 3 months ago, Daniel admitted softly. He knew about the transfers. He gave me a chance to tell you everything myself. My heart ached so sharply I pressed one hand against my chest again. Richard had tried one final time to save our son before giving up on him completely. What did you tell him? I whispered. Daniel's breathing grew shaky again. I told him I would handle Vanessa. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. Weak men always believe they can manage dangerous situations quietly without making difficult choices. Meanwhile, damage spreads beneath them like water through cracked foundations. But you did not, I said softly. Daniel did not answer. He did not need to. Across the booth, Harold reached slowly into his briefcase and removed another document before sliding it toward me silently. It was a photograph taken by Richard's private investigator. Vanessa standing outside a downtown office building beside a man I did not recognize. Gregory Mills. The same name from the email records. The timestamp showed it was taken nearly 8 months earlier. 8 months. This had been happening while Richard was still alive. While we still sat together watching old movies on Sunday evenings. While I folded laundry upstairs thinking my family was safe beneath one roof. Mom, Daniel said carefully through the phone, pulling me back to the present. Vanessa thinks you know where Dad hid something. Harold looked up sharply at that. What exactly does she think I know? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. Again, she believes Dad moved the final controlling account somewhere before he died. I stared at Harold instantly. Richard's final account. The one only I could access now. Daniel lowered his voice further. She is convinced there is paperwork hidden inside the house, proving where the money went. Martha muttered something bitter under her breath, while Harold remained perfectly still beside me. And what do you believe? I asked my son. For the first time since answering the phone, Daniel sounded genuinely exhausted. I think Dad was protecting you from us. Those words landed like stones inside my chest. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. I suddenly remembered something Richard told me years ago after Daniel left for college. We were sitting on the back porch drinking coffee while fireflies flickered across the yard during summer twilight. Children do not become adults all at once, Richard said quietly back then. Sometimes they just become taller versions of whatever weaknesses they never outgrow. At the time, I thought he sounded overly philosophical. Now I finally understood. Mom, Daniel's voice softened again. I need to see you. I looked toward Harold instinctively. His expression hardened immediately. Very slightly, but enough. Why? I asked. Because Vanessa is getting desperate. My stomach tightened again. Desperate people do reckless things, Daniel whispered. And I think she finally realized Dad outsmarted her before he died. Silence settled heavily between us again. Then Daniel spoke one final sentence that made the air leave my lungs completely. Mom, she found the hidden camera Dad installed in the basement this morning. The moment the call ended, silence settled over our booth like heavy fog. I slowly lowered the phone onto the table while my heartbeat pounded unevenly beneath my ribs. Richard installed a hidden camera in the basement. Even now, after everything I had learned during the past 2 days, that detail still stunned me somehow. My husband hated confrontation. He believed privacy mattered. He once apologized to a neighbor for accidentally opening the wrong mailbox 20 years ago. And yet during the final months of his life, he became desperate enough to secretly record his own family inside his own home. That thought alone told me how frightened he must have been near the end. Harold rubbed one hand across his jaw thoughtfully while snow continued drifting outside the diner windows. If Vanessa found the camera, he said carefully, then she probably knows Richard was documenting something. Martha snorted bitterly. Good. Maybe panic will finally ruin her perfect little smile. But Harold did not look reassured. No, he said quietly. Panic makes manipulative people unpredictable. The waitress returned briefly to refill coffee cups before disappearing again without interrupting us. I stared down into the dark coffee while Daniel's voice replayed inside my head. I think she is starting to scare me. Fear changes people, but guilt changes them faster. For the first time since Richard's funeral, Daniel sounded less like Vanessa's partner and more like a man realizing he built his life beside someone he no longer understood. The tragedy was that realization arrived far too late. Do you think Vanessa knows about the final account? I asked softly. Harold shook his head immediately. No. Richard would never have left direct evidence inside the house itself. He was too careful for that. Martha leaned back in the booth and crossed her arms. Then what exactly is she searching for? Harold's eyes shifted toward the folder beside him. Control. None of us spoke for several seconds after that, because deep down we all understood he was right. Money was never just money to someone like Vanessa. It represented power, security, status, victory. And now, for the first time in years, that control was slipping beyond her reach. Harold checked his watch before speaking again. We need to move you somewhere safer than the motel. I frowned slightly. Safer? If Vanessa becomes desperate enough, she may try contacting you directly. Martha gave a dry laugh. She already threw Eleanor out. Now suddenly she wants to talk? Harold's expression remained serious. People become very persuasive when millions of dollars disappear unexpectedly. The number still felt unreal every time it surfaced in conversation. $12 million. Commercial properties. Investments. Trust accounts. Richard built all of it quietly over decades, while still mowing our lawn himself every Saturday morning, because he hated paying neighborhood teenagers for work he could still do. I suddenly remembered him fixing our old dishwasher with duct tape rather than replacing it, because he believed wastefulness was a form of disrespect. Meanwhile, under the same roof, Vanessa viewed every family dinner and holiday gathering as part of a long financial strategy. The contrast made me feel physically sick. Harold paid the bill quietly before we left the diner together. Snowflakes drifted across the parking lot now, soft and steady beneath the gray afternoon sky. The cold air stung my cheeks the moment we stepped outside. I pulled Richard's old coat tighter around myself while we walked toward Harold's car. Then my phone vibrated again. Daniel. This time I did not answer immediately. I simply stared at his name glowing across the screen while memories rose painfully inside me. Daniel at 8 years old helping Richard shovel snow in oversized winter boots. Daniel graduating college while crying harder than I did during the ceremony. Daniel dancing awkwardly with me at his wedding reception because he knew I hated dancing alone. How does a mother separate those memories from the man who signed papers behind her back while his father was dying? You do not owe him anything right now, Martha said quietly beside me. But I still answered. Mom, Daniel said immediately, sounding more frantic than before. She found more stuff downstairs. Harold looked toward me sharply while I moved slightly away from the others beside the car. What kind of stuff? I asked carefully. Daniel lowered his voice. Dad kept copies of bank records hidden behind the workbench. My stomach tightened instantly. Did Vanessa see them? Yes. Snow crunched softly beneath my shoes while I listened. And Daniel exhaled shakily. She knows Dad was tracking the transfers now. Harold mouthed silently from several feet away. Put him on speaker. I pressed the button slowly. Daniel's voice filled the cold air around us. She completely lost it when she saw the records. She keeps saying Dad tricked her. Harold stepped closer immediately. Daniel, he said calmly. This is Harold Bennett. Silence exploded through the line. Then Daniel swore softly under his breath. You are with my mother? Yes, Harold replied evenly. And I suggest you listen carefully. Snow continued falling around us, while passing cars hissed softly along the wet road nearby. Vanessa is going to realize very soon that the trust structure changed before Richard died, Harold continued. When that happens, her behavior may escalate. Daniel's breathing grew uneven again. I did not know she was stealing that much money. Harold's expression hardened slightly. But you knew she was stealing. Another silence. Long enough to answer everything. Finally, Daniel whispered. I thought I could stop it before Dad found out. My chest ached hearing the shame in his voice. Because for the first time since all this began, I believed him. Weakness had destroyed my son long before greed did. Weak people tell themselves lies because truth requires courage they do not possess. Daniel, I said softly, where is Vanessa right now? He hesitated. Upstairs. Something in his tone immediately unsettled me. Doing what? More silence. Then quietly. Packing. Harold and Martha exchanged quick looks beside me. Packing for where? Harold asked sharply. Daniel lowered his voice further. I think she is planning to leave. My pulse quickened instantly. With what? Another pause. Then Daniel answered in a near whisper. Dad's backup hard drives are gone. Harold's entire posture stiffened immediately. What? I checked the basement office after she went upstairs, Daniel said quickly. The cabinet behind Dad's drafting table was open. The hard drives are missing. Harold cursed softly under his breath for the first time since I had known him. Martha looked genuinely alarmed now too. What was on those drives? I asked. Harold answered before Daniel could. Evidence. Snowflakes melted slowly against my coat sleeve while fear spread cold and heavy through my stomach. Richard spent months collecting proof against Vanessa. Bank records, security footage, emails, financial trails. And now somehow, after all his careful planning, she may have gotten access to pieces of it. Daniel, Harold said firmly, listen to me very carefully. Do not confront her directly. Do not tell her where Eleanor is. And if she leaves the house, you call me immediately. Daniel's voice sounded small suddenly. Exhausted. Harold, I think she already knows Mom controls everything now. The world seemed to go still around me for one terrible second. How? Harold demanded. Daniel swallowed audibly on the line. Because she found Dad's final letter to me this morning. And before she locked herself upstairs, his voice cracked slightly. She said if she cannot have the trust, then nobody will. After the call ended, none of us moved for several seconds. Snow drifted quietly across the parking lot while cars passed along the street without noticing the way my entire world seemed to tilt beneath me again. If she cannot have the trust, then nobody will. The sentence replayed inside my head over and over like a warning bell. Harold opened the passenger door quickly and motioned for us to get inside the car. His calmness remained intact, but I could feel urgency beneath it now. Controlled urgency. The kind professionals develop after years of handling dangerous situations without letting panic show on their faces. Martha climbed into the back seat, muttering under her breath, while I settled slowly beside Harold in front. The heater hummed softly as snow melted against the windshield. We need to assume Vanessa is unstable now, Harold said quietly while starting the engine. And desperate people make reckless decisions. I stared out the window toward the gray afternoon sky. What exactly could she do? Harold pulled carefully out of the parking lot before answering. Financially? Quite a lot. Emotionally? Even more. The city blurred past outside while my thoughts returned again and again to Daniel's voice during the phone call. Fear, shame, regret. But underneath all of it, there was still hesitation. My son was finally waking up to the truth. Yet part of him still seemed unable to fully separate himself from the woman who helped destroy our family. Love can survive many things, but manipulation often disguises itself as love long enough to confuse people permanently. Harold drove us directly back toward the motel, though this time he parked near the rear entrance instead of the main lot. Just precaution, he explained when he noticed me watching him check the mirrors carefully before shutting off the engine. We entered through a side hallway that smelled faintly like bleach and old carpet cleaner. The motel suddenly felt less like temporary shelter and more like hiding. Inside room 214, Harold immediately spread additional files across the small table, while Martha locked the door behind us twice. Snow tapped softly against the windows now, and early evening darkness had already started settling across the parking lot outside. Harold opened his laptop and inserted the second flash drive from the safe deposit box. Richard labeled this drive separately, he explained quietly, which means whatever is here mattered enough to isolate. My pulse quickened instantly. The screen flickered briefly before a folder opened containing several video files dated over the past 6 months. Harold clicked the earliest one first. Grainy basement footage appeared. At first, nothing happened except the empty workshop sitting beneath dim overhead lights. Richard's drafting table, tool cabinets, stacks of neatly labeled storage boxes. Then movement. Vanessa entered the basement slowly sometime after midnight, carrying a flashlight. My stomach tightened immediately. She moved carefully, between shelves, opening drawers and examining papers while glancing repeatedly toward the stairs behind her. Not casually searching, hunting. Martha folded her arms tighter beside me. She looks like a burglar in her own house. Harold remained silent while the footage continued. Vanessa eventually stopped near Richard's workbench and knelt beside the lower cabinet. A few seconds later, she removed a folder and began photographing documents with her phone. The timestamp showed this happened nearly 4 months before Richard died. She was already stealing records back then, I whispered. Harold nodded grimly. And Richard knew. The next video loaded automatically. This time the footage showed Daniel entering the basement alone during daylight hours while Richard was presumably upstairs. He looked nervous, restless. He searched through drawers quickly before finally sitting down heavily at the workbench with his head in his hands. For nearly 2 full minutes, he simply sat there motionless, defeated. Then Vanessa entered behind him. Even through grainy security footage, her expression looked sharp and impatient. She spoke rapidly while Daniel shook his head several times. Finally, Vanessa leaned closer and handed him paperwork. After a long hesitation, Daniel signed it. My chest tightened painfully. The property transfer draft. Richard had filmed the moment my son crossed the line he could no longer uncross. Pause it, I whispered suddenly. Harold stopped the video immediately. I stared at Daniel frozen on the screen, holding the pen in his trembling hand. My little boy. The child who used to sleep beside our golden retriever during thunderstorms because he worried the dog felt lonely. Now sitting in his father's basement signing documents behind his back while his father fought cancer upstairs. Tears burned behind my eyes, but strangely, anger no longer overwhelmed me the way it had before. Only sadness remained now. Deep, exhausted sadness. He knew it was wrong, Martha said softly beside me. I nodded once without speaking, because I could see it clearly on Daniel's face even through grainy footage. Guilt had already started destroying him long before consequences arrived. Harold loaded the final video file carefully. The timestamp showed it was recorded only 9 days before Richard died. The basement appeared empty at first again. Then Richard himself slowly entered frame carrying a stack of folders against his chest. He looked painfully thin, frail enough that seeing him walk alone downstairs made my throat tighten immediately. But his eyes remained steady, focused. He placed the folders on the workbench before sitting heavily in the chair facing directly toward the hidden camera. For several seconds, he simply stared silently ahead as though gathering strength. Then he spoke. If you are watching this, Eleanor, then I did not stop them in time. Hearing his voice again nearly broke me completely. Richard rubbed one hand tiredly across his face before continuing. I wanted to believe Daniel would choose differently. I gave him every chance. Harold lowered his eyes respectfully while the recording played. But weakness repeated long enough becomes a decision, Richard said quietly. And Vanessa understands that better than anyone. Snow continued tapping softly against the motel windows while the room remained completely silent except for my husband's voice. There is something you still do not know, Richard continued. Vanessa was not working alone. Harold looked up sharply at that. Martha frowned beside me. My pulse quickened instantly. Richard opened one of the folders on the workbench and removed several photographs. Gregory Mills is not simply a financial consultant, he said carefully. He is Vanessa's brother. The air seemed to disappear from the room completely. Harold cursed softly beneath his breath, while Martha stared at the screen in disbelief. Richard continued, speaking calmly despite exhaustion visible in every movement now. They planned this together long before Daniel understood what was happening. My stomach twisted violently. Gregory, the man from the emails. The man photographed meeting Vanessa downtown months earlier. Family. This entire scheme had been carefully built from the beginning. Richard leaned closer toward the camera slightly. Daniel believed Vanessa wanted security, stability, a future. But Gregory, Richard's expression hardened painfully. Gregory wanted control of the trust assets themselves. Harold immediately reached for a notebook beside him and began writing quickly. Meanwhile, I sat frozen staring at Richard's tired face on the screen. My husband uncovered everything while dying. Alone, quietly protecting us until his final breath while the people around him pretended to love him. Richard paused again, breathing heavily now. If Gregory realizes the trust transferred fully to Eleanor, he will push Vanessa to act quickly. My heartbeat pounded harder instantly. Harold looked toward me sharply. That changes things. How? I asked quietly. Harold's face tightened. Because now we are not dealing with desperation alone. He glanced toward the frozen image of Gregory Mills on the screen. We are dealing with coordination. The room suddenly felt much smaller around me. Outside, snow continued falling steadily while motel lights flickered across the dark parking lot. Everything looked quiet. Still. But beneath that silence, danger had already started moving toward us long before I ever realized my family was broken. Then my phone vibrated again on the table beside me. This time it was not Daniel calling. It was Vanessa.